Don't let a normal blood sugar test result fool you for another second. In the United States, millions of seniors currently have biomarkers bordering on type 2 diabetes, but are completely overlooked during routine checkups, not because it is hidden, but because mainstream medicine is testing a variable with a time lag of up to 20 years. Here are 10 signs that you are becoming insulin resistant, even when your blood sugar levels are normal. First, you might feel hungry after a meal or crave food about 1 to 2 hours after eating. This happens because insulin resistance causes the body to secrete too much insulin as cells resist it, and there is also a delay in the release and action of insulin. At this point, your blood sugar rises excessively and insulin spikes, and whenever it spikes, your blood sugar can also plummet. Here is the incredible part. It is the actual speed of that blood sugar drop that triggers hunger and cravings, not necessarily because your blood sugar reading itself is low. So, after you eat, your blood sugar response looks like this. Both insulin and glucose rise together. First, glucose goes up, and then immediately after, insulin is triggered to rise, creating a continuous cycle and a coordinated response where they support each other. Normally, it should start at a low level, rise slightly, and then quickly stabilize for both glucose and insulin. But if you are insulin resistant, insulin does not work effectively, so you start at a higher level, and then there is a delay that prevents insulin from acting quickly. Because it is not working effectively, your body keeps pumping out even more insulin, and your blood insulin levels spike very high. When this excessively high amount of insulin forces your blood sugar to plummet, the blood sugar eventually stabilizes, but this process takes much longer, and that is where the sudden drop happens. It is the rapid rate of that decline that is the real issue. It happens too fast, and that is what triggers those feelings of hunger and cravings. The second sign is a drop in energy and feeling tired after meals. What happens here is that food provides glucose, which enters the bloodstream through digestion and absorption. Insulin is the hormone that helps usher this glucose into the cells to feed them. Normally, we do not need a lot of insulin to maintain normal blood sugar levels, but when we are insulin resistant, it means we have eaten too much. We have supplied too much energy. We have been pumping fuel into our cells for a long time, and those cells have become resistant to insulin. Consequently, insulin no longer works effectively. And even though the pancreas tries hard to secrete more insulin, this hormone still lacks the power to quickly bring blood sugar back to an ideal level, and blood sugar may begin to rise slightly. So, the end result is normal or slightly elevated blood sugar, but that is just what is happening in the bloodstream. What is actually happening inside the cells is that because the cells resist the effects of insulin, which is exactly what happens with insulin resistance, less glucose makes its way inside, even though there is plenty of glucose floating around on the outside. As a result, we do not have enough glucose inside our cells to generate energy, causing our energy levels to crash. It makes perfect sense. The third sign is brain fog or trouble focusing. The brain is the body's largest consumer of energy, using about 20% of the body's total glucose, and it depends on insulin, but in a different way than most other cells in the body. Insulin must enter the brain to do its job, but first it has to cross the blood-brain barrier through a transporter system that can become saturated. The word saturated is very important here because it means we can overload those transporters. So, if we have chronically high insulin levels over time, the body downregulates by reducing the number and activity of these transporters, preventing insulin from crossing the blood-brain barrier effectively. In that sense, the brain still becomes insulin resistant, just through a different mechanism. Ultimately, unless insulin can reach the brain cells, glucose cannot be brought in to be used as fuel. The mechanism is different, but it basically plays out the same way, because we now have impaired signaling and glucose utilization in the brain cells. The end result is identical. We have less energy available for our brain cells, leading to that feeling of brain fog and a lack of focus. The fourth sign is an expanding waistline, because insulin is a storage hormone. Its job is to take excess fuel and convert it into fat, saving it for future use, and it usually targets the liver and visceral fat. As a result, excess fat accumulates in the abdominal area because the liver processes all this surplus fuel and turns it into a storable form of fat called triglycerides. But the liver is also constantly active, and it exports these triglycerides into the bloodstream as VLDL. However, the very first place they go is into the visceral fat surrounding the liver. That is why we tend to store fat in the liver and visceral areas first. This can happen even if your weight stays stable. You might notice that fat is being redistributed internally, right toward your belly, for two reasons. There are more receptors in visceral fat than in subcutaneous fat, and both insulin receptors and cortisol receptors play a role in this process. Over time, as we get older, many of us also notice a loss of muscle mass, which is driven by both the natural aging process and a sedentary lifestyle. If we are not doing weight-bearing or strength training exercises, our muscles have no reason to maintain themselves and will start to waste away. At the same time, we gain weight, and that weight gets stored as fat. This leads to a condition known as TOFI, which stands for thin on the outside, fat on the inside. Fifth, we struggle to lose weight. Weight loss becomes incredibly difficult, even when we feel like we are doing everything right. One of the mechanisms at play here is that high insulin levels inhibit an enzyme called HSL, or hormone-sensitive lipase. Lipases are a broad group of enzymes responsible for breaking down fat. We have digestive lipases, pancreatic lipases, and so on, but this specific type of lipase lives inside our fat cells. As mentioned earlier, the purpose of a fat cell is to store energy for future use, and HSL is the enzyme that breaks down that stored fat, so we can release it and burn it for energy. However, when insulin is high and hormone-sensitive lipase is inhibited, we can find ourselves in a constant energy-storing state, even during a calorie deficit. We have stored all this energy and want to tap into it, but we simply cannot. We remain stuck in storage mode. That energy is completely locked away. What is more, because we cannot access this stored energy, we end up feeling hungrier and craving more food. So, we fail to burn fat and end up eating more. This is why understanding these mechanisms is so crucial. Many people who lose weight easily will just say, well, just eat less. But if you are experiencing the processes we are talking about, it is not a willpower issue. Your physiology is actively working against you because over time, your body has become insulin resistant. The sixth sign is if your blood work shows high triglycerides and low HDL levels. So, what happens when you are insulin resistant? As we discussed, your cells take in less glucose, and you also burn less fat. Consequently, the liver stores more fat. It releases more triglycerides into the bloodstream by producing more VLDL, which stands for very low-density lipoprotein. That is how the liver packages fat to send into the blood and deliver to the cells. So now, we have an increased amount of fat in the blood, but fat burning is down because the cells do not want it. As a result, these triglycerides, which are at a much higher concentration, have nowhere to go. Normally, lipoproteins, carriers like HDL, VLDL, and LDL, are constantly exchanging components back and forth. This is a normal process. They both contain cholesterol and triglycerides, but in different ratios, and they are always trading with each other. When triglycerides in the blood are high, some of them get pushed into the HDL particles, which makes those HDL particles unhealthy. This increases their triglyceride content and lowers their cholesterol, which is the exact opposite of what healthy HDL should look like. These HDL carriers then shrink, becoming very small. As a result, their half-life is shortened, meaning the amount of time they stay active in the bloodstream is greatly reduced. Ultimately, our total HDL levels drop. This is a crucial concept to understand because having high triglycerides and low HDL is one of the classic signs of insulin resistance, inflammation, and poor metabolic health. And it is not because the body is failing to produce HDL. The body is still making it, but the HDL is simply breaking down too fast. The seventh sign is a gradual increase in your blood pressure over time. This happens because high insulin levels signal your kidneys to reabsorb sodium and water at a much higher rate. As a result, we retain more sodium in water, creating an imbalance caused by high insulin. Normally, we have a mechanism called blood pressure regulation, where the body does a wonderful job of keeping things in check. But with insulin resistance, that mechanism is disabled. It is crucial to understand that your blood pressure can start climbing very early on, even when your blood sugar is completely normal. Before we continue, if you want health information explained in plain, simple language without any hype or exaggeration, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. My goal is 50,000 subscribers, and you can absolutely help me reach that milestone. The eighth sign is sleep disruption from waking up too many times in the middle of the night. Now, I want to emphasize that this is the weakest piece of evidence among the 10 points I am raising, but the underlying mechanism makes a lot of sense. So, some of this is probably still happening. One of the classic signs of insulin resistance is that the body loses its ability to properly regulate blood sugar, and as a result, our blood sugar levels become less stable at night. Most people do not think about this, but even though you ate the day before and are sleeping through the night, your body still needs to keep your blood sugar stable, and right now, that process is not working as well as it used to. You see, we have insulin to lower blood sugar, but we also have a counter-regulatory system to bring it back up, and this is exactly what happens at night. But with insulin resistance, the system and signals we rely on to raise blood sugar also become less stable. And those counter-regulatory hormones we are talking about are glucagon, cortisol, adrenaline, and human growth hormone, or HGH. But when it comes to waking up at night, adrenaline is the specific hormone that triggers your nervous system to wake you up. Adrenaline is a fast-acting stress hormone that spikes your heart rate and puts you on high alert. Cortisol is also released naturally. So, your cortisol levels rise every night, and this does not necessarily wake you up. It is not the main culprit here, but it still contributes to that alert state when you do wake up, working alongside adrenaline when your blood sugar plummets. Meanwhile, glucagon works to raise blood sugar in the liver, and growth hormone is also part of this feedback loop, but it has very little direct effect on keeping you awake. It does not play a major role. The ninth sign is high uric acid levels. This is something you will see on a blood test because insulin resistance reduces the kidney's ability to excrete uric acid. If those levels get too high, it can lead to a very painful condition called gout. When uric acid forms tiny crystals that settle in your joints, it feels as painful as stepped-on broken glass. One of the most commonly affected joints is the big toe, or, in milder cases, it might just show up as a slightly elevated reading on your blood work. The reason we need to keep this in mind, even before any symptoms show up, is that this shift often happens before your blood sugar or lipid levels start fluctuating. So, this is one of the earliest warning signs we can use to screen for insulin resistance. It is still widely overlooked, but it is incredibly easy to test. And the 10th sign is the strongest indicator we have for recognizing insulin resistance. It is when we get a blood test and find high insulin levels, while our blood sugar is still perfectly normal. But the problem is, routine insulin testing is almost never ordered. There is a clinical formula called HOMA-IR, which stands for Homeostasis Model Assessment of Insulin Resistance. It is a simple calculation where we take your glucose level, multiply it by your insulin level, and then divide by 405 to get a much simpler, manageable number. The beauty of this formula is that it looks at both sides of the coin. Your blood sugar will usually stay stable for a very long time because the body keeps it under tight control. But when we look at insulin, this formula shows us just how hard your body is working to maintain that control. For example, in a healthy person, their fasting blood sugar might be 90 milligrams per deciliter, and their insulin is 4.5. I generally consider the optimal insulin range to be between 2 and 5, so any reading in this window is excellent. Now, when we plug those numbers into the formula, we get a result of approximately 1.0. That is why scientists use the constant 405, because it gives us a result right around 1.0, making it easy to remember and evaluate. Typically, the standard safe range for fasting blood sugar is cited as 65 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. So, if your blood sugar creeps up slightly to 92, it still looks pretty close to 90 on your lab report. But in reality, your body has already started drifting toward insulin resistance, and your insulin levels are now much higher. For instance, if your measured insulin has climbed to 15, your HOMA-IR score would shoot up to 3.4, clearly warning that insulin resistance is underway. So the reason we want to understand this formula, the insulin number, and the HOMA-IR score, is to know exactly how insulin resistant we are and how hard our insulin is working to keep this balance. So even though the glucose levels are almost identical in both cases, in the second scenario, the HOMA-IR score has jumped nearly 3.5 times higher, showing a massive increase in insulin resistance, while the glucose level barely budged. From this, we have to understand that glucose is a tightly controlled variable. It is not that we should not check it just because it is simple. We absolutely still can. But because it is so well regulated, it won't tell us much in the early stages. The body is doing everything it can to keep it at a certain level. Now, if we compare things to look at the progression, let's watch the glucose curve and the insulin curve. A healthy insulin-sensitive person might have numbers like we saw earlier, say a blood sugar of 90 milligrams per deciliter and insulin at 4.5 micro-international units per milliliter. But 5 years later, if we only check blood sugar, we might not see any difference at all. The reading could stay the same or fluctuate by just a few points. It might even be 88 milligrams per deciliter because you walked a lot that day or ate something different. But over time, as we become more insulin resistant, the body has to work harder to control blood sugar. Because of this, insulin levels can double. 10 years later, they are even higher, and 15 years later, they could quadruple, all without really affecting your blood sugar, because that high insulin level is stepping up and working incredibly hard to keep your blood sugar in check. And then, 20 years later, we might finally see the first signs of blood sugar starting to spiral out of control and climb past the 100 milligrams per deciliter threshold. Over time, insulin has to work harder and harder. This increase is not necessarily a perfect straight line, but it is fairly predictable and much more linear because it is the variable that directly reflects how hard the body is working, showing exactly how insulin resistant we are. Blood sugar only changes significantly after the body's systems break down. When the endocrine system is exhausted and can no longer compensate, that is when we enter the diabetic stage, and blood sugar spirals completely out of control. Before that, blood sugar remains almost completely flat for 10, 15, or 20 years, and only when the body weakens do we start to see blood sugar spike. This tells us that blood sugar is actually the very last domino to fall, and this can happen after 20 years of silent progression of insulin resistance. Now, this is exactly why I am making this video. This is something incredibly important to understand. Think about all the signs, all the health issues, all the imbalances we have talked about in this video. Every single one of them is directly tied to an insulin problem. It is not blood sugar causing these issues. The real culprit is insulin. Yet, insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes are almost always viewed and treated simply as a glucose problem. The entire world is completely obsessed with glucose while totally ignoring insulin. And remember, all the consequences we have discussed in this video are insulin problems, not glucose problems. Now, what is even worse is that current treatments only focus on managing the symptom, which is glucose. Many treatment plans aimed at lowering blood sugar actually choose to increase insulin, such as injecting synthetic insulin or giving you medication to stimulate your body to produce even more insulin. And in doing so, They are unintentionally making the root cause, insulin resistance, much worse. Everything we have discussed is about the body being out of balance because of insulin resistance, yet the treatment itself makes that resistance even more severe. That is why we absolutely must understand insulin. But ironically, healthcare providers will check your blood sugar every single time. Yet if you actively ask for an insulin test, they will often push back against it. As of now, the total cost of healthcare in the United States has reached a staggering $5.7 trillion in 2025. They constantly require patients to undergo so many expensive tests and scans costing thousands of dollars, yet they refuse to spend just about $20 on a simple insulin test, even if you ask for it. Even though insulin resistance is the leading health issue in the world, if we start testing insulin levels early, we will have a great chance to better understand and fully manage this process. So, please keep this in mind, proactively talk to your doctor about a fasting insulin test, and share this video so we can start spreading the word on how our bodies actually work. I have listed all of the scientific studies in the description for your reference. If you like this video, and if you really want to take control of your health by understanding how your body works, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Click the bell icon and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any useful information in the future.